Hello and welcome to Gegenpressing, the Bundesliga podcast. I'm Manu. He is Stefan Bienkowski. This is the preview show, and Stefan, we set it on top of the show. It's Thursday, but it feels like it's already Thursday next week because this is how long this week has been.
Yeah, it's a slog on these European weeks. It's a lot. My wife is away right now for work in London, so I feel like I've spoke to you more than her because we have. It's like we have these evening daily catch ups where we just talk about things on this podcast. And yeah, by the end of the week, it starts to feel a bit tiresome. But no, it's not a problem to have. It's been fun. Quite a lot to talk about actually, and.
Mhm.
Yeah, I'm kind of looking forward to this show because it gives us an opportunity to talk about some of the things we haven't had a chance to talk about because obviously the big teams tend to dominate.
Yeah, no, and we had, I mean, we had such a great week of football. I actually think, obviously, for some teams, the results were better than for others. And looking at Bayern Munich here, right? But I think it just gave us so much to talk about. The Wednesday show, for example, right, where we broke down the Bayern game. The Substack just exploded. It was a little bit slower today for the Europa League matches, Stefan. It picked up a little bit towards the tail end of Eintracht Frankfurt beating Besiktas 3-1, which I actually thought was another outstanding performance by them. Earlier today, Hoffenheim with a big win over Dynamo Kiev in the Europa League as well. And we shouldn't forget them, Heidenheim, with them first with the first victory in a European group stage match. They beat Olympia Ljubljana 2-1. Who else but Paul Wanner with the with the golden goal, right, winning it. Had a penalty denied and then put it across the line. It's only a question of time until Nagelsmann has no choice to call him up. That also actually brings us to the next item before we talk about all of this. Stefan, next week is an international break, so things will be a bit different with the show. People who have been following us for a little bit longer know that we usually take the foot off the pedal a little bit during the international break. I, in fact, will be going up to Tofino for a few days. It's the last time I'll be able to go away before the little one arrives. So anyways, that means a little bit of a slower pace next week, but we are going to talk about the national team, I think, next week because we had some questions come in. But let's start with Hoffenheim. So much noise ahead of this Bundesliga match day. There's been a bit of a civil war going on, kind of like the Chelsea of the Bundesliga a little bit, with Dietmar Hopp and him giving back the shares and Alexander Rosen getting fired, and the only survivor of the sporting team is Pellegrino Matarazzo, and the start hasn't been very good. And then this week, rumors about David Wagner coming in and replacing poor Pellegrino Matarazzo, and then this result against Werder Bremen where they were up 3-0 and then a red card, and Bremen come back and they win 4-3, and it's been kind of chaotic. And then today, I thought the response by them was really excellent. A 2-0 win at home against Dynamo Kiev. I think Pellegrino Matarazzo, considering that everything that's going on, has really found the right answers to what is a crisis at the club, and a crisis that's probably not gone away, because if they are speaking to David Wagner, when something like that leaks, that they're speaking to him, right? But it's a really tough situation, and I think they were so excellent of what is still a very crucial ahead of a really crucial Bundesliga game for them, Stefan.
Yeah, absolutely. It's interesting how even like one result can change things actually because
Mm,
I was listening to the press conference with Matarazzo beforehand, and he was very defiant. He said he had no doubt about he's going to be able to turn things around. And he really talked about how he was really trying to accentuate the positives and said, they were so good in against Bremen until I think they got a man sent off in the 20th minute, if I'm not mistaken.
yeah.
And he was like, before that, we were going man for man with them. I thought we were the better team. And he was basically saying, the reason that he's confident is that he's like, this team have been through hardship with me before and we got over it. So he feels like they can persevere together. And it really felt like this team were really playing for him against Dynamo Kiev in this game. And I think even something like Klozek finally scoring a couple of goals can be huge for Hoffenheim, because they are just still so incredibly reliant on Kramaric. And I know people have been saying that for probably the last like 5 or 6 seasons, because he has just been the most incredible talisman for them. But they really needed Klozek to come in and kind of step up and kind of take some of that load off Kramaric this season. Hasn't quite happened for him just yet. And then, of course, tonight he does exactly that. And I think, I think the interesting thing about the game against Stuttgart is that they can basically go into it with not any real pressure on them, because, I mean, obviously there's pressure on it just about any Bundesliga team. But I think the thing is that they go into that game obviously extremely unlikely to win it. Stuttgart are heavy favourites. It's away from home, and it's a free hit, And I don't think Matarazzo is really going to get sacked, depending on how he does away to Stuttgart, a team that finished, in the top 4 last season and have gone toe to toe with Real Madrid and thumped Borussia Dortmund and all that. And as we actually talked about on the Champions League show, on one of the bonus shows this week after the Stuttgart game, and their struggles this week in the Champions League, they are beginning to kind of build up this kind of odd habit of taking their foot off the ball against quote-unquote lesser sides. They seem right now like a team, Stuttgart, that is very good at going toe-to-toe with big teams, but when they play teams that they have to maybe break down, or teams that sit defensively, or teams that don't really throw everything at them, they maybe struggle a little bit. So I do kind of wonder if Matarazzo watched that game midweek and kind of thought, if we can get our tactics right here, we might actually be able to put in a decent performance here and keep this score respectable, maybe even nick a point. And then they go into the international break, and they've got Bochum, Heidenheim, Nuremberg in the Pokal, and then St. Pauli. They've got Porto and Lyon in the Europa League, which honestly doesn't really matter at this stage. And then they've got, after St. Pauli, they then have Augsburg. So, they've got, 4 or 5 very winnable domestic games there. After an international break, where presumably Matarazzo will have the opportunity to try and fix things and, get everyone into the training ground, change tactics, get everyone on board. So, I feel like if they can just kind of get through that game against Stuttgart on Sunday, and their head's still above water, then, Matarazzo might be able to get out of this.
I think that the game against Stuttgart is going to be really fascinating, because it's two teams that had tough opponents in very different ways in the Europa League, right? I mean, I think that Hoffenheim, the way that they, with Hoffenheim, it was more the situation that they were in that made it difficult, right? Whereas for Stuttgart, it was the coming off this high of a really positive string of results. And I mean, I include the defeat to Real Madrid in that, because I think they played so well, right? And then all of a sudden having this really tough nut to crack in Sparta Braha. And now they have to transition back to playing in the Bundesliga against a Hoffenheim side that I thought looked very, very determined today. And really looked like a team that was just trying to get it back together. And Oliver Baumann, the goalkeeper, who we are actually going to probably have to talk about next week for one of the national team shows, Stefan, he said that he just felt relief after the match that they had such a stable performance, especially after that really weird game against Werder Bremen. And he said, we could tell if in this game that things are going well within the team, responding sort of to what's all these coaching rumors that are going around, right? Again, the big name is David Wagner. We all know his work in England and his stint in Schalke that went well and not so well, right? And probably, hoping to get a position somewhere in German football, and probably wouldn't be a terrible fit at Hoffenheim if in my opinion they hadn't already had a really good coach in Pellegrino Matarazzo. But it makes this match so intriguing, because it is a quote unquote derby, both from Baden-Württemberg, although I think a lot of people in Baden-Württemberg still don't qualify Hoffenheim as a real club. But that's not my words, by the way. I'm just quoting people from Baden-Württemberg before anyone goes after me. Matt Ford, I can see Matt Ford sitting in the back row nodding in agreement. So, but I do think this is going to be really interesting because if Hoffenheim, I think we'll give him a little bit of an example of how to approach the Stuttgart team, right? And of course, Pellegrino Matarazzo knows Stuttgart so well because before he was at Hoffenheim, and they sort of switched coaches by Hoeneß going to Stuttgart and Matarazzo going to Hoffenheim. But I think this is actually going to be one where, as you said, everyone expects Stuttgart to win this game, but the flip side of that is that Matarazzo probably knows more than any other coach in the Bundesliga how to maybe beat the Stuttgart team.
Yeah, that's very true. I mean, God, a lot's changed since then.
True.
Very different Stuttgart teams, even what it was 2 seasons ago, I suppose. I just think the key thing's going to have to be defense. Hoffenheim have just absolutely shipped goals this season. They've got the second worst defensive record in the league. Even then, if you flip it to like expected goals against, they're second worst. Only Bochum have conceded more chances than them. But again, I think that result against Dynamo Kiev was really telling because Dynamo Kiev only managed to rack up an XG of 0.46. Now, of course, Dynamo Kiev aren't a Bundesliga team, and God knows they've gone through untold issues in the last year, and it's really not fair to really expect them to be competing at this level and, or even at a Bundesliga level. So I don't want to kind of put that on them by any means. But, it was probably quite telling that Hoffenheim had Stark back in defence. Grealish, who has had to fill in at centre back for much of the season, was back in midfield. They looked maybe more structured in this game, but that'll be the key thing this season. Because, like I said, I think if there is a way for kind of mid-table or lower league teams in the Bundesliga to kind of chip points off Stuttgart this season, I think it will be if they can put up kind of strong defensive performances. Hoffenheim haven't really shown that they can do that really in the Bundesliga yet, but they put in a solid performance in midweek, and if they can kind of plug those holes in defence, then I honestly wouldn't be surprised if they took a point from this game. I just find Stuttgart to be such a hot and cold team right now. They're a team that are obviously transitioning themselves with new players, and they're having a very transitional season. So they do seem to be dropping points in between these big performances, and sharing a point with Hoffenheim would not surprise me at all.
Yeah, no, I think you're totally right there. And it's again, that's why it's going to be such a fascinating game. Let's just transition to the next topic here, and that is going to be one particular man that you already highlighted: 7 goals, 5 assists in 8 games across all competitions. Who are we talking about, Stefan Bienkowski? You should know.
I have no idea what you're talking about.
Absolutely no idea. May play for Egypt, Eintracht Frankfurt.
Oh, sorry, of course. I thought you were talking about Kramaric or something there. I was like, has he done that well already? No, of course, Marmouche, who had an outstanding game once again against Besiktas in the Europa League. A game that was quite interesting, I must admit. It was very back and forth. It was very box to box. It was exactly what you expect from an away game in Turkey, to be honest with you. I had a lot of sympathy, actually, for the Scottish referee, who maybe wasn't outstanding, but he looked absolutely petrified throughout the entire match.
I thought he was good.
Yeah, I don't think it was bad by any means, but it was a pretty hectic game. Robin Koch doing his best to give away penalties whenever he could, but despite that, Frankfurt came out and it was a game which they managed to win without Hugo Ekitike. I know he came on in the second half, but it was a game in which Topmoller decided to go with Matanovic up front. Götze played in his kind of number 10 or maybe almost like a false 9 role. Marmouche kind of playing all over the pitch. And, Frankfurt, they're quite interesting right now. They strike me as this very fluid, very attacking team at this moment in time, and I must say I'm really enjoying watching them. They're maybe not as defensively sound as they once were last season, which is interesting.
Mm.
It kind of feels like Top Bowlers just kind of taking the reins off this side and just kind of let them, run free and do what they want. And so far, it's working quite well for them because they obviously have some outstanding players in there. But it's a good team. It was a good performance, and they've got a big game on at the weekend, don't they?
Yeah, they sure do, and we have to talk about it. But before we talk about that, and I mean, this is why Omar Marmouche is, I think, going to be the main protagonist on the weekend as well. I think he was one. If I not, if I don't remember wrongly here, Marmouche scored against Bayern last year, didn't he? In that 5-1 win. Let me just fact check here live as we're recording this, because I am pretty sure, yes, he scored a goal and 2 assists in Eintracht Frankfurt's 5-1 win on December 9th at the Waldstadion in Frankfurt. And I think he's going to have an absolute field day if Upamecano plays like he did midweek against Aston Villa. I think that Marmouche probably on current form is no worse than Juan Duran is, right? The Aston Villa striker that scored that goal. And, he's so fast. His ability to turn around and turn defenders around as well and do it in... going to Turkey and play at Besiktas is extremely difficult. The sound in the stream that I watched on the Zone was kind of weird and muffled because they have to do something special to the broadcast studios to sort of ensure that you can still actually hear the commentators with all the noise that's going on inside the stadium. So to do it on that stage, I think is very impressive. And I mean, Frankfurt are known for this. They're the Euro fighters, right? They're the sort of team that goes to these big venues and has in recent years always kind of shown that they can perform. But I think it's so important what you mentioned about Dino Topmöller, because despite the fact that they actually had a pretty decent record in the Bundesliga last year, right? One of the better ones. They didn't win anything. I think that's what the criticism was about. And I think the other criticism was that it was often a bit too defensive and a little bit boring. And that is just not something that goes over well in Frankfurt. This is a city that is demands good, fast-paced attacking football. And I do think that with Topmöller took all that criticism to heart that he received last year. And of course, he was given the players to also maybe build on what he did last year as well. I think we need to add that as well, right? But, I think that they are in phenomenal form at the moment. They're only 1 point behind Bayern Munich. They went to Turkey and played their game. A little lucky that Immobile was offside ahead of Robin Koch, bringing him down outside the box, because I think that is a red card. Even though I don't think he did it on purpose, I still think that would have been a red card. Have to mention that. But, I think it's going to be so fascinating. And you put it into the Substack chat, Marmouche against Upamecano, Stefan. I mean, that is the duel that all neutrals will be looking forward to, and Bayern fans, and I already see the responses coming in, are going to be very worried about, I think.
Yeah, well, obviously Frankfurt have a habit of kind of being a thorn in Bayern Munich's side, and not maybe historically, but certainly in kind of recent seasons. And yeah, it's going to be a really interesting match for a few reasons because, as you said, Frankfurt have looked good. I mean, I still think they are bizarrely a little suspect defensively this season. If you do kind of look at their stats compared to last season, they're definitely far more attacking, far more counter attacks. Making far less challenges. Last season, they were a team that were far more interested in kind of playing possession football, dominating, making sure they pressed harder, but didn't score as many goals. But this team obviously do well. And look, that's just maybe a sign of Top Muller being a very kind of adaptable head coach, because he realizes, hey, I've got guys like Marmouche up front, I've got Ekitike, we signed this guy Matanovic who wants to start. Even players like Hugo Larsson, I think every time I watch Frankfurt, he's absolutely busting a gut to get into that box, to get onto the end of the balls. And I've got his stats in front of me. His shots per 90 have doubled in the Bundesliga this season compared to last year. His expected goals have gone from 0.05 per game to 0.23. He's already scored as many goals as he did the whole of last season. So he's obviously kind of really stepping up his game too. And I think just the team in general are far more attacking. It'll just be super interesting to see how they come up against this Bayern team. And I do kind of wonder if Top Muller watched that game against Aston Villa and saw the kind of troubles that Bayern had when a team were able to more or less bypass that press. Bayern obviously want to try and constrict these opponents in the opposing half, but what Villa did really well was they had Ollie Watkins was just a fantastic target man almost, and they could almost bypass Bayern's midfield, have players playing off him. And then they had chances, but they had a chance to really run at Bayern. And obviously Duran comes on and scores more or less a wonder goal, really, to steal the win. But I don't think man for man Frankfurt are as good as Aston Villa, and I don't think they're probably as good defensively either. But they do have a lot of interesting attacking players. And if there's one thing about Marmouche and Hugo Ekitike is that they've both formed this really impressive partnership with one another, and they're both outstanding counter-attacking players. Marmouche just looks like a player who is more than happy going toe-to-toe with any defender right now. He just takes everybody on. He doesn't win it all the time, but he just takes them on. He just has confidence just kind of flowing out of him at the moment. And Hugo Ekitike, in the previous Europa League game, I thought he was unplayable. He was absolutely outstanding. And both of them just love getting around the pitch. They both are happy to drift. They're happy to move it wide. They're happy to play off each other. And I think there'll be a real nightmare for Bayern to try and keep track of. So I still kind of expect Bayern to win this game because Frankfurt's defense isn't quite great, and I think there is an issue with his goalkeeper, which we maybe have to talk about. But which seems really harsh because he obviously saved a penalty, but he does seem to have a clanger in him, and considering how many shots Bayern are probably going to fire that Frankfurt goal at the weekend, I don't suspect he's going to save them all.
No, and he had such a great game until he didn't.
It's the folly of being a goalkeeper, isn't it?
Yeah, but he was so good. And then I know it was 3-0 and it didn't matter ultimately, but he pretty much laid an egg, didn't he, when Besiktas scored that final goal. And that is actually, I think it is quite worrying. If I was Frankfurt, I'd be worried about it because, I mean, yeah, okay, fine. Bayern Munich's goalkeeper also laid an egg this week, so I guess they're even. But you know what I mean? It's just he will have to probably play a perfect game in order to Frankfurt to get something, unless they do what they did last year and just score 5 goals, right? But with that in mind, I think that Santos situation, and I'm just looking up what the status is for Kevin Trapp. Yeah, he's still going to be out for this game, so it will be Santos in goal, and that is, I think, maybe something that they have to worry about a little bit as Santos is growing to be a Bundesliga goalkeeper. He's learning on the job, right, which is a tricky proposition, and. Yeah, he will have to be perfect in this game, and if he can't be, then Frankfurt will just have to hope that they're scoring a lot of goals. But I think what I was really impressed about Frankfurt in this game was the depth that they had. They didn't even, as you mentioned, they didn't even start Ekitike in this one. He came off the bench. Instead, it was Igor Matanovic, 21-year-old striker that we have mentioned a couple times already on this podcast, right? German-Croatian striker who plays for Croatia. You know who he reminds me of? Mario Mandzukic.
That's interesting.
Yeah, similar. Just the way he moves. Obviously he still has a way to go to become Mario Mandzukic. Mandzukic such a big player for Bayern Munich, won the Champions League with them, played at many big clubs on top of that, reached the World Cup final with Croatia as well in Russia in 2018, right? But yeah, Iko Matanovic just moves similar to Mario Mandzukic. It's a really interesting profile of a player, and we all know that Frankfurt is such a good school for strikers, isn't it? And it's a really handy thing for Dino Topmüller to go to a place like Istanbul, play Besiktas, and still be able to rotate your side, right? Dahoud started in this match, for example, as well. Matanovic started up front. He did then bring on Hugo Larsen, came off the bench. Skiri came off the bench. Knauf came off the bench, who also scored a wonderful goal with the outside of his foot, right? Just curled it perfectly into the far corner to make it 3-0. So there is some good depth in this team, and this I think is going to help Frankfurt with this game on Sunday, which I think that Sunday is going to be utterly fascinating in the Bundesliga, to bring it back to the preview show, because all the big matches are going to be pretty much on Sunday, except for one that we're going to talk about. But yeah, Frankfurt, Bayern, and then to round it up, Stuttgart against Hoffenheim. I think those two games are going to be just huge and must-watch games, Stefan.
Yeah, absolutely. We kind of talked about Bayern after the Aston Villa game and the pressure that's now on Vincent Kompany, and I suspect that means that Frankfurt will probably be really up against it, because there'll just be no complacency in that Bayern team. I'm intrigued to see what kind of team Kompany puts out, because I think he maybe overthought his starting 11 in that Aston Villa game. So we'll see
I think so
how
too.
he approaches the the Frankfurt match. But I think Frankfurt have their blueprint. I think they obviously looked at Aston Villa and what they did, and I think they could probably think, well, we've got good, fast, quality forwards. We just have to try and maybe fall back in what we did last season with the defensive football, and then trying to hope that Marmouche and Hugo Ekitike can do the rest. But it'll be a fantastic game, and another big test for Vincent Kompany, I think.
Yeah, no, absolutely. All right, let's move on then to our final topic in this preview show. Union Berlin against Dortmund. Which Dortmund team is going to show up for this one, Stefan? No Adeyemi, by the way. He's out, injured. Will be out for a few weeks, which is why he's not in the national team. That's a huge loss.
It's a huge loss. It's another problem. Just when you kind of hope that things were kind of beginning to turn up for him, he just kind of struggles a little bit. Hopefully it's not a huge setback, because he really did look on fire against Celtic. I think this is actually going to be a really fascinating match. Union Berlin have done actually quite impressively well, I think, so far this season. Obviously losing to Gladbach last weekend was their first defeat in the league. They've got the second best defensive record in the league. If you look at their expected goals against, only Freiburg and Bayern Munich have a better defensive record. And obviously where I am in the world, there's been a lot of discussion about Celtic and Borussia Dortmund, and quite a lot of people were kind of thinking, wow, this Dortmund team were really fantastic after watching them against Celtic. And I had to say, look, guys, I'm sorry to burst your bubble, but Dortmund are not fantastic. Celtic just made them look fantastic. And it'd be really, really interesting to see what Union Berlin can kind of do to kind of burst that bubble, because I think they've had a pretty strong start to the season. They do have an issue with scoring goals. And, it's a problem that, Bo Svensson is going to have to try and figure out how to solve, because I don't think they're going to get to where they want to be by just being a defensive-only side. But, I suspect that we might see a very cagey match, and it's going to be a hard one for Dortmund to win. But having said that, as much as obviously Adeyemi picking up an injury is a huge blow for Dortmund, I do kind of wonder if this is a game that's actually better suited to someone like Girassi, or a Daniel Malen, perhaps playing off him, because maybe in these kind of matches, And I think this was the case in Dortmund's previous game before the Celtic game, which feels like it was about a million years ago. We were talking about that Bochum game. And I remember saying after that game, obviously Bochum went 2 goals up, and then Dortmund pulled it back with a Guirassy goal. And I said on the show on the Monday, I think, it was just a simple cross from Julian Brandt into the box. Guirassy leaps above everyone else and knocks into the back of the net. And I said on the show on Sunday or Monday, that's what Dortmund maybe needs to do a lot more of this season. Yeah, it's great that you have your Adeyemis and your Duranvilles and your Jamie Bittens, and you can get really you can create these very intricate attacking systems, but I think they have to also remember, and to be fair, I think they are doing a good job of this. I think they do appreciate having Guirassy up front, but this feels like the kind of game where they maybe just have to absolutely overload that Union Berlin box and just wait for Guirassy to get in the end of one of those crosses, because I suspect Union Berlin are going to make it very difficult for them.
And Union Berlin have a sneaky good start, right? I mean, I mentioned it, I think, on the main show. It's good for them to be boring. So and that's I think they after the turbulences that they had. By the way, have you seen the renderings that they released today on the new stadium? The expansion of the Alte Försterei.
No, I have not. No.
Yeah, it's going to be over 40,000. Well, I'm saying seats because that's actually a lie. Most of it is going to be standing area, but they're planning the biggest stadium in terms of standing area. And I guess now with UEFA allowing this, right, that you can have pretty much unlimited standing area as long as it's safe standing. The new renderings of the Alte Försterei just look spectacular, and they're going to go and have a much bigger facility than they have had in the past. So that's interesting. But yeah, I think that I think they have the potential here to make things really, really interesting for Borussia Dortmund. And with interesting, I mean frustrating. And I thought it was really intriguing that you mentioned Guirassy, because I look at the projected lineups in Kicker magazine, and they think that Duranville is going to start in this game for Adeyemi, which is probably not the worst idea in the world, together with Gittens, by the way. And I guess what the idea here is, maybe behind that, is to try to create one-on-one situations to break down this Union Berlin defense. But, at the end of the day, what as you said, what it might need is really just a ball into the box to Guirassy and have him hope that he can do the rest. And that has maybe been a little bit of a difference from last year too, right? I think going into the last few matches, we've been wondering, is what Guirassy did last year, was that a little bit of a one-hit wonder kind of situation? And I think now we can kind of look at his numbers. And what we see here is it's 6 goals in 5 matches across all competitions. And, 3 of those goals came in the Champions League. So, he scored every 59 minutes for Borussia Dortmund this season, Stefan. So, I don't know. Do we still call him a one-hit wonder? Were we wrong in our skepticism here, maybe?
Oh yeah, he's undoubtedly proven us wrong so far. I think he's had a great start to the season, and all power to him, because he's obviously grasping this opportunity with both hands, and I think he has been a huge difference maker for Dortmund. I think I said that after the Celtic game when we did a reaction. I said, Dortmund still have the defensive issues. Celtic still managed to score a goal through absolutely hilarious tomfoolery from Emre Can in his own box. More or less heading the ball into his own net after about 10 seconds after scoring a penalty, which I think sums up Emre Can and Borussia Dortmund quite well, to be honest with you.
It's been dropped by Nagelsmann, eh? Do you see?
Yeah, well, I'm just waiting for the day he's dropped by Dortmund, to be perfectly honest with you. But despite all that those defensive mishaps which we've seen time and time again this season, the attack does seem to be clicking into gear, and I think Adeyemi missing will be a huge problem from that, because I think if it was someone like Daniel Malen, then there might be a big drop off. But Duranville has looked so hungry for games. He looked so hungry for to prove himself whenever he has come on. It'd be interesting to see how he does if he does start, because I think with young players, particularly in these kind of out wide forward positions, there's almost like a kind of fallacy that because they're very good at coming on late in matches, when the game's stretched, when the defense is tired, when perhaps your team have already won the game, people look at those performances in 15 or 20-minute stretches and think, right, well, that guy should be able to do it for 90 minutes. Why are we not starting him? And it's something we hear about Matthijs Tel for Bayern Munich fans over and over and over again. And I understand they're clamouring for a young player to start and the hope that he'll just develop into an outstanding player. But I think there's a big difference for players of that age between coming on as a substitute when your team are, either chasing a game or have already won it up against tired defenders and starting the game. And, I think Nuri Sahin's been actually quite reluctant to kind of throw Jamie Gittins in there when he can. So I suspect he'll probably be quite conservative, Duranville too. Maybe he will start, who knows, but I'd be quite surprised actually if he started over Daniel Malen, but stranger things have absolutely happened, so I certainly wouldn't be beyond the realms of reason. But, it's also worth bearing in mind that they'll be up against a series test in Union Berlin, who, kept a clean sheet against St. Pauli, kept a clean sheet against RB Leipzig. They went down to a decent Gladbach team, I think, with a lot of actual good attacking potential. And I think people still think of Gladbach as this kind of bumbling mid-table team, and I guess they are until they prove otherwise, but they do have a lot of really good attacking talent in that team. Obviously, Kevin Stoger is one of the best playmakers in the division. Klein Dines is obviously an outstanding
Been called
man.
up by Nagelsmann.
Yeah, exactly. And it was Kuvan Chara, whose name I can never pronounce, the young striker who's got a lot bags of potential. Obviously got the goal in that game. So, I think it's probably quite telling that a team like Gladbach managed to put them down, but whereas a team like Leipzig, who have been a bit all over the place in an attacking sense this season, struggled to do so. So yeah, I think it'll be a huge test for Dortmund. I really do. And equally, I'm also a little intrigued to see how Union Berlin can do to kind of counter-attack Dortmund, because I would not be surprised in the slightest if they kind of watched that Bochum game last weekend and thought, there's definitely something to be had there at Dortmund. And for all their success in an attacking sense, they have conceded 5 goals in their last 3 Bundesliga games against Heidenheim, Bochum, and Stuttgart. Yes, Stuttgart are obviously, more than that actually, so I tell an absolute lie. It's 9 goals, not 5, because Stuttgart obviously scored 5. But 4 goals against Heidenheim and Bochum. Surely Bo Svensson is looking at that thinking, well, if they can do that, so can we.
Yeah, no, I think so too. And I think unlike Bochum, they will probably be able to see out the result. So, I think that is a huge difference. Just defensively, I think they're stronger. Bo Svensson, I think the world of him as a head coach. I think he's a really, really good coach. And he is the perfect fit for Union Berlin to do what they need to be doing this year, which is to be semi-boring. To finish. Maybe finish in the Conference League, something like that, but be mostly boring and sort of just kind of calm things down a little bit. And yeah, I think that's the mission here. And if that, means a boring 0-0 draw against Borussia Dortmund, I think most Union Berlin fans would happily take that.
Yeah, without a doubt. And you kind of wonder after the kind of struggles that Dortmund have had recently whether they would take a point from this game. And, it is obviously worth saying that despite the kind of ups and downs that Dortmund have had, they are still relatively solid in the Bundesliga table. It's the way we talk about them, sometimes you would think they're like sitting 13th or something, but they're actually, 3 points off Bayern Munich in first place and level on points with Leverkusen. So it's not all doom and gloom by any means, but they've still to pick up a win in the Bundesliga on the road this season. And if they can do it against Union Berlin this weekend, that'd be really impressive, I think.
Yeah, no, I think so too. Definitely, I think the Saturday match to watch, and I think we're all going to tune into that. Looking forward to this match day, and then a little bit of an international break. After that, we're going to talk, of course, about Julian Nagelsmann's latest little selection at some point next week, before we take a little bit of a mini break. As always, this podcast is brought to you by Bet Online. And Stefan, we have a great lineup of content, as always, on the Substack. So if you haven't signed up for it yet, there is the Champions League shows. We broke down all the Champions League matches for behind the paywall, right? Then this is so long ago. You wrote about Bayer Leverkusen and their ambitions in the Champions League this year. Matt Ford did a great article on the fan scene and the issue of second teams in the Dritte Liga. And I wrote something on Enzo Milo that has Stuttgart fans steaming in the chat. Because I said he will be the next record transfer from VfB Stuttgart, outgoing transfer. I'm sorry, but I think it's unavoidable considering the economics of world football, Stuttgart fans. But I'm also not afraid that you will find someone else who's just as good. So, yeah, I'm sorry. Anyways, we'll be back soon with more. And until then, auf Wiedersehen.